17%. That is the share of the world's entire oil supply that flows through a single choke point, a strait so narrow you could drive across it in under an hour. On April 17, 2026, Iran's foreign minister posted a single tweet. No signed agreement, no verified guarantee, no diplomatic framework, just words on a screen announcing that commercial passage through the Strait of Hormuz had been fully restored. Within hours, CENTCOM contradicted him. The blockade, they said, continues. Let that sink in for a moment. Iran held the most powerful economic leverage in the Middle East, a choke point worth 17 million barrels of oil per day. And in a single unilateral social media post, with nothing secured in return, that leverage was gone. But the tweet was not the crisis. What happened inside Tehran in the 48 hours that followed, that is what no one is talking about. Every major outlet covered this story the same way. Iran backed down. America won. The blockade worked. And on the surface, that framing is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete because it stops exactly at the moment the real story begins. The question that actually matters is not whether Iran blinked. The question is who inside Iran allowed it to happen and who is now being made to pay for it. To understand that, we need to look beyond the diplomatic language, beyond the press releases, beyond the carefully worded statements from Washington and Tehran alike. In this analysis, I will give you a strategic lens that mainstream coverage does not apply because it requires looking simultaneously at budget data, military command structures, and 47 years of institutional power dynamics inside a system that is now consuming itself. This is not a story about a tweet. This is a story about a regime at war with itself. And the fault lines run deeper than anyone is reporting. Before we analyze the collapse, we need to establish the foundation. Because the Hormuz crisis did not begin on April 17th. It was the final pressure point applied to a structure that had been weakening for years. Let us start with the data. The Strait of Hormuz, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, serves as the transit point for approximately 17 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That figure represents roughly 21% of global petroleum liquids. For context, when this strait experiences even minor disruptions, maritime insurance premiums spike within hours, and that cost travels directly into fuel prices across every oil importing nation on Earth. This was Iran's last remaining card of strategic leverage, and the regime knew it. Now look at what was happening beneath the surface before that card was played. In late December 2025, the Iranian rial hit a historic low. One US dollar reached 1.5 million rial. Not a gradual decline, a structural freefall, documented by Reuters and confirmed by multiple regional financial tracking sources. Then examine Iran's own budget architecture for 2026 to 2027. According to analysis published by the Atlantic Council, oil revenue's share of Iran's national budget collapsed from 32% to just 5%. 5%. That is the lowest oil revenue dependency Iran has recorded since the 1960s. To compensate, the government raised taxes by over 60%, a move that economists classify as inflationary financing. In plain terms, the state was systematically extracting value from its own population to fund its operating deficit. This is the economic reality that existed before the Hormuz Gambit was played. Now the 48-hour sequence. On April 17th, Foreign Minister IRGC posted on the platform formerly known as Twitter that all commercial vessel passage through the Strait of Hormuz had been fully restored. No signed agreement accompanied this announcement. No formal diplomatic framework. No documented guarantee of reciprocal concessions from Washington. The same day, CENTCOM issued a statement directly contradicting him. The blockade, according to U.S. Central Command, continued uninterrupted regardless of Iran's unilateral declaration. President Trump then announced publicly that the United States had secured an agreement in which Iran would cease uranium enrichment. Iranian officials disputed the characterization almost immediately. The result was unambiguous. Iran had publicly surrendered its primary point of economic leverage. The blockade remained in force. The economy continued its deterioration. No peace framework existed. No enrichment agreement was confirmed by both parties. Within hours of IRGC's tweet, media outlets directly linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began publishing accusations of treachery against him. A hardline commentator on state television stated openly that IRGC had demonstrated excessive flexibility regarding financial and military support to Hezbollah. Since that broadcast, IRGC has neither spoken publicly nor been seen. A foreign minister vanished after one tweet. That single data point tells you everything about the pressure building inside the system. But the receipts do not stop there, because what happened next was not a political disagreement. It was the simultaneous ignition of three separate internal conflicts, each one capable of destabilizing the regime on its own. And all three ignited at once. To understand what is fracturing inside Iran right now, you need to stop thinking about it as a single government under pressure. What you are actually looking at is three distinct power centers, each with its own institutional interests, its own historical grievances, and its own definition of what Iran is supposed to be. And the Hormuz collapse did not create these tensions. It detonated them simultaneously. Let us go through each front with precision. This conflict did not begin on April 17th. If you have tracked IRGC behavior across the past decade, from the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action negotiations, in 2015, through every subsequent diplomatic engagement, you will recognize a consistent pattern. Every time Iran's civilian diplomatic wing moves toward a negotiated framework, the IRGC's institutional response has been to undermine it. Not occasionally, systematically. The logic is structural, not personal. The IRGC's entire organizational identity, its budget allocations, its regional network of influence across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, all of it depends on a threat environment that justifies its existence. A normalized Iran, reintegrated into the global economy through diplomacy, is an existential threat to the Revolutionary Guard's institutional power base. So when IRGC's tweet signaled a potential shift toward de-escalation, the IRGC-linked media apparatus did not hesitate. They labeled him a, quote, JCPOA diplomat, a deliberately damaging reference to the Obama-era deal that hardliners have spent a decade portraying as Iran's greatest strategic humiliation. A senior commentator on state television explicitly stated that IRGC had shown flexibility on reducing financial and military support to Hezbollah. That single accusation, broadcast on state media, was not commentary. It was a political termination notice. The opposing view here deserves acknowledgement. Some regional analysts, including those writing for Middle East Eye, have argued that IRGC may have been operating under direct instruction from the supreme leadership, that the tweet was a deliberate probe to gauge international reaction rather than a genuine concession. If that reading is correct, the IRGC's response was not an act of institutional rebellion, but of calculated theater. The problem with that interpretation is that IRGC's subsequent disappearance from public life is inconsistent with a planned diplomatic maneuver. Planned probes do not make their architects vanish. This is the conflict that carries the deepest historical weight and the one that threatens the foundational architecture of the Islamic Republic itself. The entire ideological framework of the Iranian state rests on the principle of vilayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Supreme political authority in this system belongs not to generals, but to scholars of Islamic law. That principle was the revolutionary innovation of 1979. It is what separates the Islamic Republic from every other military-dominated state in the region. When a three-person committee of IRGC commanders begins making decisions that the elected president cannot override, when that president cannot even select his own cabinet ministers without military approval, the theological underpinning of the entire system begins to dissolve. Parliamentarian Morteza Mahmoudi stated publicly that were it not for wartime conditions, he would have demanded resignation. He accused senior figures of making untimely statements that repeatedly stabilized global oil markets during sensitive periods. In other words, of inadvertently relieving economic pressure on Iran's adversaries. Former Culture Minister Ayatollah Mani went further, warning openly that Iran was losing not only the military dimension of this conflict, but the psychological and informational dimensions as well. Consider what that means. A former minister of the Islamic Republic, himself a cleric, publicly acknowledging that the regime is losing the narrative war. That is not standard political friction. That is institutional panic expressed through diplomatic language. Historically, this matters enormously. In 1989, when Ayatollah Khomeini died, the transition of supreme authority was managed within hours through a functioning civilian religious command structure. Rafsanjani and the incoming supreme leader, Khamenei, coordinated a seamless handover. That infrastructure existed because the clerical establishment retained genuine institutional authority. In 2026, that infrastructure does not exist in the same form. And the mullahs are watching a system they built and legitimized for 47 years transform into something they no longer recognize and no longer control. This is the most dangerous front, and it is the most underreported. The people who filled the streets across more than 200 cities and all 31 provinces during the January 2026 uprising, documented by BBC Persian and Al Jazeera, were not the regime's traditional opposition. They were not the secular liberals of northern Tehran. They were not the exile community broadcasting from Los Angeles. They were the people who believed, the families who sent sons to the front during the Iran-Iraq War, the communities that endured decades of sanctions as the price of standing against what the regime called the Great Satan. They accepted that price because they were told it was temporary. They were told the resistance economy would make Iran self-sufficient. They were told Iran would never surrender. The budget data said otherwise. The empty ATMs said otherwise. The hospitals without medicine said otherwise. The power cuts lasting 12 hours a day in the middle of winter said otherwise. And when the Hormuz tweet landed on top of all of that accumulated disillusionment, something broke that is very difficult to repair. Not the opposition's faith in eventual change, the base's faith in the regime's core promise. Among the protest slogans documented by the House of Commons Research Service, voices calling for the restoration of the Pahlavi monarchy emerged with notable frequency. Analyze what that means strategically. The Islamic Republic's entire claim to legitimacy was constructed on the foundation of having overthrown the Shah. If a measurable segment of the population, including former supporters, is now publicly saying they want back what was overthrown, the ideological contract of 1979 is being openly renegotiated on the streets. The regime's response followed a pattern that analysts at Crisis Group have described as characteristic of systems under terminal legitimacy stress. On the 22nd of Bahman, the revolution's anniversary, families of detainees from the January uprising received a direct message: attend the rally or face increased sentences for your imprisoned relatives. The regime was not mobilizing believers, it was conscripting hostages. And when video evidence of security force responses to protesters began circulating internationally, State-linked figures, including the Friday prayer leader of Mashhad, declared publicly that all footage was artificially generated. When a regime can no longer suppress the truth, it declares the truth itself to be false. 3 fronts, 3 simultaneous institutional crises, each one serious enough to destabilize a government on its own. But there is a 4th dimension to this collapse, one that sits above all 3 fronts and makes every one of them harder to resolve: a leadership vacuum at the very top of the system. And what has moved into that vacuum is something Iran's founders never intended and Iran's allies never anticipated. Here is the detail that changes everything. For over 35 days following his selection as supreme leader, Mujtaba Khamenei has not appeared publicly. No verified photographs, no live address, no direct communication of any kind. A small number of written statements have been published under his name, but according to reporting by NBC News, those statements are being read aloud by others. Think about what that means in the context of an active geopolitical crisis. The person who is supposed to sit at the apex of the entire Iranian decision-making architecture, the individual whose authority is constitutionally absolute, is functionally invisible. And into that vacuum, 3 men have moved. 3 men nobody elected. 3 men who share a single institutional origin: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. According to former Iranian Member of Parliament Ali Akbar Musavi Kanehi, speaking directly to NBC News, the individual currently running Iran is IRGC Supreme Commander Vahidi, not the president, not the foreign ministry, not any clerical council. Vahidi. The evidence for this assessment is not circumstantial. President Pezeshkian, the elected head of government, has been unable to finalize his own cabinet appointments. Vahidi has been directly blocking ministerial selections. In March, Pezeshkian issued an apology to Gulf states regarding Iranian regional policy, and the IRGC publicly contradicted him within hours. An elected president overruled by a military commander on a matter of foreign policy in real time, on the record. That is not a civil-military tension. That is a completed power transfer. Currently serving as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, the body that formally coordinates Iran's highest-level strategic decisions. His appointment, according to documented reporting, was not initiated by the president. It was imposed through Vahidi's direct pressure on Pezeshkian. Zolgada's institutional loyalty runs not to the elected government, but to the command structure that placed him there. One of the founding commanders of the IRGC itself, led the organization for 16 years, now serving as the new supreme leader's military advisor, which, given Khamenei's absence from public life, effectively means Rezaiei operates without meaningful civilian oversight of any kind. Here is the historical data point that gives this particular appointment its full strategic weight. In 1988, as the Iran-Iraq War approached its conclusion, Rezaiei wrote directly to Ayatollah Khomeini, arguing that Iran should not accept United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, the ceasefire framework that would end the war. Khomeini overruled him, accepted the resolution, and described the decision in his own words as drinking a poisoned chalice. But Khomeini had the institutional authority and the revolutionary legitimacy to force that decision through, even against the IRGC's resistance. In 2026, there is no equivalent figure. No one in the current architecture has the authority or apparently the intention to make Vahidi, Zolgada, or Rezaiei drink any poisoned chalice. The restraining mechanism that prevented military maximalism in 1988 no longer exists in functional form. Foreign Policy's published analysis has described Iran's current condition as a post-clerical transition, a moment in which the security establishment has moved from mediating politics to governing directly. When you remove the theological layer from a theocracy, what remains is a military administration with religious vocabulary. And that creates a problem that extends well beyond Iran's borders. China purchases a significant share of its oil supply from Iran under long-term arrangements, but those arrangements require a counterparty with clear decision-making authority. When Beijing cannot determine with confidence who has the power to honor a contract, the risk premium on every transaction increases. Russia has supplied military technology to Iran throughout the current conflict period. But sustained military cooperation requires predictable institutional interlocutors. A command structure consumed by internal suspicion and parallel authority claims is not a reliable partner for anyone. And at the negotiating table with the United States, Washington faces a structural paradox. American diplomats cannot identify with certainty which Iranian figure possesses the actual authority to make and honor commitments. Negotiations require counterparties. Right now, Iran's counterparty is undefined. The opposing view, advanced by some analysts at Chatham House, holds that IRGC consolidation may paradoxically create short-term stability by eliminating the friction between civilian and military decision-making. A single unified command, the argument goes, is more predictable than a fractured one. That argument has a critical flaw. Predictability requires legitimacy. And legitimacy, in this case, comes exclusively from institutional coercion, not constitutional mandate, not popular consent, not clerical authority. A system held together only by the concentration of force is not stable. It is pressurized, and pressure without a functioning release valve does not dissipate. It builds. At this point in the analysis, some of you may be thinking this is a regional power struggle in a country most people cannot locate on a map without assistance. Why does it reach me? That is precisely the right question to ask, and the answer is uncomfortable. The U.S. Energy Information Administration documents that approximately 21% of global petroleum liquids transit the Strait of Hormuz daily. That figure is not an abstraction. It is the input variable for an enormous chain of downstream costs, maritime insurance premiums, freight rates, refinery throughput calculations, and ultimately the retail price of fuel in countries that have never heard of IRGC or Vahidi. When tension in the strait escalates, shipping insurers reprice risk within hours. During the Houthi disruption period across 2024, the Freightos Baltic Index recorded container freight rate increases exceeding 200% on key routes through the broader Middle East corridor. A sustained Hormuz instability scenario would apply pressure to that index at a magnitude that makes the Houthi disruption low OK like a calibration exercise. That cost does not disappear. It travels through every logistics node, every distribution center, every retail shelf until it arrives invisibly in the price of goods that ordinary consumers purchase without any awareness of where the increase originated. Consider the transmission mechanism with precision. Crude oil prices rise under Hormuz stress. Elevated crude prices increase the production cost of petrochemicals. Petrochemicals are the feedstock for fertilizers. Fertilizer costs directly determine agricultural input prices. Agricultural input prices drive food production costs. And food production costs determine what you pay at the market for goods that have no visible connection to a Middle Eastern strait. This is not a theoretical chain. It is the documented pathway through which geopolitical friction becomes household inflation silently, without announcement, without attribution. For economies across Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, which according to Ministry of Industry and Trade data imports approximately 70% of its petroleum requirements, the exposure is structural rather than incidental. Every percentage point increase in global crude prices applies direct pressure to domestic fuel subsidies, transportation costs, and by extension, the price of everything that moves on a truck. Inflation is not a headline. It is a tax that no legislature voted for, collected by no government, and paid by everyone who holds a currency that is quietly losing purchasing power. Here is the mechanism that affects you even if you never purchase imported goods directly. When import costs rise, central banks face pressure to maintain or increase interest rates to contain inflationary spillover. Higher interest rates increase the cost of mortgages, business loans, and consumer credit. A family refinancing a home loan, a small business owner seeking working capital, an individual carrying credit card debt, all of them are paying a premium whose origin traces back through a long but unbroken chain to decisions made in Tehran and Washington. The butterfly does not announce itself. It simply moves its wings. In the interest of analytical integrity, the counter-argument deserves space. Several economists, including those contributing to the International Monetary Fund's regional outlook assessments, have argued that global markets have substantially priced in Middle East risk premiums following years of recurring regional tension. Additionally, expanded production capacity from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates provides a meaningful short-term buffer against Iranian supply disruptions. That argument is valid under one critical assumption: that the current Iranian instability does not escalate beyond its present parameters. Given that we have just established a leadership vacuum at the apex of the Iranian state, a military committee with no historical precedent for accepting diplomatic compromise, and 3 simultaneous internal crises with no visible resolution mechanism, that assumption deserves serious scrutiny. The optimistic scenario requires stability from a system that is, by every measurable indicator, becoming less stable by the week. And the cost of being wrong about that assumption is not absorbed by the analysts who made it. It is absorbed by you. Let us take stock of where we are. A regime that said it would never surrender, surrendered. A theocracy built on the absolute authority of Islamic scholars is now functionally governed by 3 unelected military commanders. A base of supporters that endured decades of sanctions, economic contraction, and geopolitical isolation is on the streets, questioning everything it was told to believe. And a supreme leader who is supposed to sit at the apex of the entire system has not been seen in over 35 days. That is not a government under pressure. That is a load-bearing wall that has already cracked. The question is not whether the structure is compromised. The question is what triggers the next fracture and how fast it travels. Throughout history, the pattern is consistent. The Soviet Union did not collapse from external missiles. It collapsed when its own bureaucrats stopped believing in the system they were administering. The Shah of Iran had one of the most modern militaries in the region until the day that military decided not to fire. Assad held rallies with enormous crowds waving flags until the moment his generals quietly walked away. Regimes do not announce their collapse. They perform stability until the performance becomes impossible to sustain. Is Iran at that threshold now? That is the question I will be examining in the next analysis, specifically whether the IRGC's consolidation of power represents a stabilization of the system or its final transformation into something that cannot survive its own contradictions. Because the most important variable in this entire equation has not yet moved. And when it does, everything changes. If you want that analysis the moment it is published, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next move on this board is coming, and you will want to understand it before the headlines do.